Humanism is a philosophy informed by science, inspired by art, and motivated by compassion. Humanists, like those gathered here today, attempt to live the best life that they can envision because this is the only life of which we are certain. Humanism affirms the dignity and worth of all people. We do this not only for all that humans have accomplished in the arts and science and humanities, but also simply for the possibility for peace and well-being when people are respected for their human potential. We have a reader today, one of our a reader that's brought us so many wonderful readings, and it's Ann Henderson.
Well, since we're going to have the comics and the graphic comics and things like that today, I thought I'd give you some words of wisdom by the Marvel and other comics people. First one, my favorite, Storm. I am a woman, a mutant, a thief, an X-Men, a lover, a wife, a queen. I am all these things. I am Storm. And for me, there are no such things as limits. Captain Marvel, who is a woman now. You have no idea what a real leader is. A leader has to project confidence, fight for what she believes in, but never stop questioning, wondering how to be better. You take in everything and make your call. Spider-Man, one of my guys. Spidey. We're not just our failures. As much as they hurt, we learn from them. Then we go out there and do our best to make up for them, even though we never will. We never will. We save people. We save as many as we can to make up for the ones we couldn't. That's all we do. Wolverine. Hugh Jackman. The key isn't winning or losing, it's making the attempt. I know I may never be what I ought to be, what I want to be, but how will I know unless I try? Sure, it's scary, but what's the alternative? Stagnation, a safer, more terrible form of death. Not of the body, but of the spirit. An animal knows what it is and accepts it. A man may know what he is, but he questions, he dreams. He strives, changes, grows. And from the iconic Superman, there is a superhero in all of us.
Oh, and that was fun. You just always find the good readings. I really very much appreciate it. Today we have a really special guest, which I'm thrilled that he is here. Joyce has worked so hard to get him to be a speaker. And he's here today. Steve Duin will be presenting on the history of comics in all their sordid glory. Mr. Duin is a longtime lead columnist at the Oregonian. He is a prolific writer in addition to his work at the Oregonian. His work includes a history of comics, 2 graphic novels, a novel, a fictional novel, The Less We Touch, and a collection of his columns entitled Father Time. Mr. Duin retired from the Oregon 8 years ago, but still writes 2 columns a month for the paper, and he wrote one this morning. He lives with his wife Nancy in Lake Oswego and counts 3 children and 3 grandchildren among his blessings. Thank you, Mr. Duin, for joining us this morning, and you'll be taking questions at the end of his presentation.
By the way, it's actually Dean.
Oh, I'm so
which is
sorry.
It should be done if you look at it.
I'm famous for mispronouncing.
Oh, that's fine.
For mispronouncing words. I mean, I always do, and I thought, I've got it. I know that. I know Steve Duin. I know that, but I didn't know it this morning.
We are good.
I so apologize.
No worries.
Yeah.
Thank you. Needless to say, for inviting me to come here and giving me the freedom to talk about something other than Multnomah County politics. So in the summer of 1989, Andre Agassi was parked in the Nevada desert filming a commercial for a camera, the Canon Rebel. Agassi was 19 years old, a talented, charismatic tennis player from Las Vegas, but he had yet to advance to the finals at Wimbledon, Australia, Roland Garros, or Flushing Meadows, much less win one of the 4 tennis majors. But in this afternoon, Agassi was told to step out of a glistening white Lamborghini with the usual bravado, lower his sunglasses, and deliver the new Canon catchphrase, "Image is everything." Image is everything? Agassi asked the director. Yes, image is everything. Until he won the first of his 8 grand slams 3 years later, Agassi would later write in his autobiography, Open, which is, by the way, if you read sports memoirs, I don't think there's ever been a better one. His co-writer of Open was the same guy who helped Phil Knight do Shoe Dog, and extraordinary book. But Agassi said that those words, image is everything, were the albatross around his neck. Overnight, Agassi writes, the slogan became synonymous with me. Sports writers liken this slogan to my inner nature, my essential being. They say it's my philosophy, my religion, and they predict it's going to be my epitaph. Agassi aspired to rise above that phrase. It may be that comic writers and comic historians do as well, but you'll see scant evidence of that in the next half hour. In this slice of comic history, image is everything. The cover images I'm about to show you are the illustrations that captured the imagination, provoked controversy, and continue to inspire collectors like me to spend ridiculous amounts of money at Comic-Con and heritage auctions. And they require this disclaimer. You are going to be offended. From the beginning, comics demanded your attention. Each and every issue needed that attention if they hoped to survive another week on the newsstand. And in the beginning, an entirely different world with entirely different boundaries and definitions on race, religion, nationality, propriety, and gender roles, comics would do whatever it took to capture your wandering eye. These are time capsules from a different world, guys, okay? So be ready. I have collected and studied comics since the age of 14, some 55 years ago. They have always been the raw, boisterous edge of my attraction to the written word and my passion for collecting. On my bookshelves at home, here are the Shakespeares. That top row are the ardent Shakespeares, one of the great collection of Shakespeare you can collect because all the covers of these books published in the 50s are different pastel colors. So they look beautiful in a bookshelf. And that matters. It really does. Here are the Alice Hoffmans on that bottom shelf. I've read just about everything Alice Hoffman has ever done. Here are the children book series, which I hope some of you guys recognize. We're talking the Chip Hiltons, the Dana Girls, and the Winston science fiction series from the late 1950s in the upper right. Here are the Frederick Buechners, which I know doesn't quite float with the greater humanists of Portland. Theologian that he is, but my favorite theologian. And here are the graphic novels. Now, most of these books over the years I found at Powell's, roaming the stacks when doctoral candidates managed the sections and book scouts haunted the aisles. The graphic novels, the search for these was a little more extensive. Now, I've written 2 of them now. Oil and Water, a tale of the Deepwater Horizon disaster and its aftermath in Louisiana, illustrated by Shannon Wheeler, a New Yorker cartoonist living in Portland. And the Mueller Report, also with Shannon. Knowing that few people would ever read that 455-page tale of obstructed justice, we hoped only that the book would end up in high school libraries. I doubt that many copies have. Over the years, I've also written a novel, The Less We Touch, the story of a group of middle school girls playing club soccer and basketball in a world through which a pedophile moves. Not an easy book to read, I hesitate to add. I've published Father Time, a collection of columns on faith and fatherhood. And 25 years ago, A History of Comics, co-written with Mike Richardson and published by Dark Horse. I spent 3 years researching that book, traveling the country to interview the great artists of comics' golden age and preparing for my rendezvous with the humanists of Greater Portland. Now, in the beginning, the attraction of comics was visceral, and there's no denying the medium was transformed by Superman's first appearance in Action 1. In 1938, and Europe littered with broken glass, this country needed superheroes, and 2 Jewish kids from Cleveland provided one. That he was an illegal alien didn't matter much at the time. That phrase didn't exist, nor the fact that he didn't bleed red, white, and blue. Superman didn't bleed, period. He was unstoppable and decent in one of those frequent occasions in history when indecency ran unchecked. If that wasn't enough, his adventures were available for a song, all in color for a dime. Though, as artist Alex Toth once said, a dime in 1936 or 37 bought you round trips on the subway and trolleys, or at the automat, a bowl of soup and coffee, or 2 chocolate bars or 4 jelly donuts, 5 daily papers, 2 copies of Liberty or the Saturday Evening Post, 10 number 2 pencils, a bottle of ink, almost a pound of coffee or a dozen eggs, or your way into an all-day Saturday matinee. All right, now, in this different world, you cannot exaggerate the power of image and art that prevailed in a pre-television, pre-Instagram world. I'm still stunned by the riotous impact of the magazines available at the corner newsstand. You're familiar with Norman Rockwell, of course, who produced 322 covers for the Saturday Evening Post over the span of 47 years. The model for this cover is Marty Hoff, who had just won top honors in a 1936 contest to determine the most perfect figure in America. 2 weeks after this issue was published, she was in Hollywood under contract to 20th Century Fox. And as pure sidebar, here is Little Orphan at the Train. This melodrama is rooted in a time in our history when, after the local orphanage burns to the ground, the kids are tossed on a train and ferried from one Bible Belt outpost to the next in a surreal quest to find homes for them all. So it is that this woman is on the platform and on the clock, or the conductor's watch, trying to make the decision of a lifetime. I want you to consider and celebrate the way that story is captured in this painting. How Rockwell figures out how to tell this story in a single frame. Or how he frames this unexpected introduction of an injured migrant worker to a young doctor here in Peach Crop. Might be my all-time favorite Rockwell painting. And if you've never seen these paintings, Rockwell's best work, it's because they're housed in the extensive collections of George Lucas and Steven Spielberg, who recognize a storyteller when they see one. Now, Rockwell was the king of the cover artists in the late 1930s, but the competition was fierce. Here's Coles Phillips on the cover of Life. This, by the way, was not the Life magazine. It was another Life magazine, sort of a precursor. Here's Coles Phillips again. Here is Enoch Bowles. Good God, how cool is this? I mean, seriously, that once upon a time, you could find images like this. Images, everything. You could find images like this down at the drugstore and pay almost nothing for them. Edwin Georgi. I got a hand that Edwin actually came along a little bit later, but I want to include him because I'm very fond of him. George Petty in Esquire with his Petty Girl, invariably wrapped up in a telephone cord and a translucent gown. And of course, the model for all the Petty Girls was George's 19-year-old daughter. And Al Parker on the cover of Ladies' Home Journal. Now you got to stare at this for a sec to sort of figure out what's going on. She's sitting on a couch. He's reached behind her. Her gloves are barely off. But Ladies' Home Journal, people. Once upon a time, these were the images that lit up the corner newsstand or arrived in the mail via Ladies' Home Journal. I mean, to have lived then and to be surrounded, I mean, look, New Yorker covers are great. I love them, but that this stuff was around. In the late 30s, when Superman arrived, the competition for attention and newsstand space was intense, and comics were competing with pulps like Weird Tales, with a cover by Margaret Brundage, All Detective, and again, one of the first opportunities you have to look at this cover and say, what in the world is going on? Yeah, I know. We have a young audience. We need to be careful. And perhaps just a little farther under the counter, a spicy or an adventure pulp with a cover by Norman Saunders or H.J. Ward. This was one of the milder ones I could find for you. Why were they called pulps? Because they were printed on pulp, the cheapest paper you could buy. They weren't meant to last much longer than the end of the month, when you could go looking for another provocative cover with a woman invariably tied up and barely dressed, facing unspeakable violence. And if you doubt the alluring, enduring allure of such an image, the original art for this H.J. Ward cover sold at Heritage Auctions in 2010 for $143,000. And if it went up for sale now, it'd go for $250,000. There's little mystery as to how the early comics rose to the competition. We're in an age of individualized media, largely fashioned to your unique taste. You select your apps, crop your Facebook page, your Meta page, personalize your Twitter feed. But comics in the golden age, from the late 30s to the late 40s, were a mass medium delivered to a mass audience with limited options. The comics were marketed gleefully to elementary school children, and publishers had carte blanche in developing creative ways to popularize the books. Why does Superman arrive in 1938? He was necessary. Another war was brewing. Hitler was moving across Europe. It was an unnerving time, and there was something utterly compelling and mildly therapeutic about a guy who was more powerful than a locomotive and a good enough swimmer to take out a German U-boat. Superman wasn't simply a hero along the likes of Buck Rogers, Flash Gordon, or Prince Valiant, earlier all-stars of the comic strips. He was a superhero, the first great superhero, and hardly the last. Batman arrives in 1939, inspired, best we can tell, by the Shadow, a character from the pulps. Another orphan, and one who watched his parents gunned down in a street robbery, Batman knew what evil lurked in the hearts of men. In his initial and darkest incarnation, he didn't smother the bad guys with web fluid and hang them from streetlights until the cops showed up. He killed them with a vengeance and never looked back. In the golden age, it was a man's world. Sometimes they had an air of mystery. Sometimes they were painful adolescents. Archie Andrews debuted in 1941. But men, supermen, were the rage. Superman had work to do, and when he was preoccupied, there was always Captain America. Now, I've long argued that comics from the beginning reflected the angst and aspirations of the age. Angst and aspirations, our fears and our dreams. These comics sold by the millions in the 1940s because there was plenty of angst to go around. Nazi Germany controlled most of Europe, the Japanese most of the South Pacific. The heroes of the comics were defined by the utter depravity of those they fought. If the heroes were too pure or patriotic to be all that interesting, the villains were spectacular. And in those early days, no one took issue with vicious stereotypes and racial profiling. The enemy was easily identifiable. This is an Alex Schomburg painting cover. We'll get back to Alex in a bit. More often than not, he was the emperor of hate. And while the comics occasionally mocked the emperor, the enemy was the embodiment of evil, a monster who would cut your throat, torch your home, and savage your women. You got to marvel at some of these covers. This one is another one by Schomburg, an artist who spent the last 40 years of his life in Newburgh. When he was pretty much confined to bed in the 80s, maybe in the 90s, I'd drive down to see him once a week while my kids played in the living room. And by the way, this was not the art on the walls of his living room, I can assure you. I'd sit with him in his bedroom and talk about his art, his career, and the imagination that summoned forth the branding iron. Like so many Schomburg covers, this is a caricature of cartoon violence. But we can't dismiss the visceral power of the image. Schomburg was personally and purposely dehumanizing the Japanese, of course, but he also wanted to personalize their savagery. These soldiers weren't simply burning our flag or strafing the White House, they were defiling our women. This cover is from 1944. That's less than a decade removed from an era in which an accusation of rape involving a white woman was enough to incite a mob and get a black man lynched in the South. And it's 11 years before the 1955 murder in Mississippi of Emmett Till, a 14-year-old boy who was beaten to death after being falsely accused of whistling audaciously at a white woman. If the superhero was the heart of the text of these comics and these images, women illustrated the troubling subtext. Yes, Wonder Woman and her golden lasso had been around since 1941, but time and again, women were the ever-available props in the sadistic carnage on the comic book covers. Comics, of course, that were designed for children. The women were invariably tied up, their clothes were falling off, they were looking over their shoulder, waiting for a real man to show up and rescue them. Another Schomburg cover, perhaps his most famous. You know, I have, and I mentioned her in my column this morning, a 2.5-year-old granddaughter. Can you imagine being a young girl growing up in a world in which everyone in the room is reading comics with stuff like this on the covers. And what you must have thought that meant for your future as opposed to theirs. I can't get my arms around that. This cover has it all: the bound woman, the real man in the upper left-hand corner, the hooded Nazis, the Tommy gun, the upraised sword. Could things get any worse? Now, does this make any sense? You're a Japanese artillery battalion. You've been marooned on an island in the Pacific for months, hiding out in tunnels, surviving on handfuls of rice. A half-dressed American beauty falls into your lap, and you hoist her onto the end of the howitzer? A few more images before we leave the war behind. Startling 49. Schomburg again. Again, if you collect comics, these are some of the most iconic images. Even when robots were on the scene, the red dress was a staple for the woman in distress. Once, one more Schomburg, and an absolute classic. Look what's going on here. In the foreground, the Nazis are injecting candy with rat poison. And outside the window, they're handing that candy out to war orphans. Great art? No. But in the shadow of extraordinary illustrators like Coles Phillips and Al Parker, there were fine artists slumming in the funny books. Here's Lily Renee. And here's Lou Fine with a masterwork of design. The way the action is framed here, the way the bodies are drawn, just extraordinary. Comic books, first of all, are junk. Cartoonist Jules Feiffer once said, and junk, like the drunk at the wedding, can get away with doing or saying anything, because by its very appearance, it is already in disgrace. It has no one's respect to lose, no image to endanger. Well, not exactly. Comic books were on a collision course with censorship and sensibility, but they still had a few more tricks to play. When the war ended and the troops came home, the industry turned to several things. They turned to horror. Familiar nightmare for some of us. They turned to science fiction. Again, extraordinary piece of art. This is by the great Frank Frazetta. And yes, they turned to romance. Intimate confessions of teenage girls who met heartache and rebuff on the path to love. As you can see, women are no longer tied up, but their clothes are still falling off. This is one of 150 romance covers from the 1950s drawn by Matt Baker, one of the few Black artists working in that era. Baker could draw both teenage women and teenage temptations, creepy though they sometimes were. How old is this guy in the picture? Another Matt Baker. I've tried every trick in the book to get him interested, but he insists on that cold professional attitude. I know one thing that will make him sit up and take notice. And one of my all-time favorites. Yes, this classic dating scenario. There's no room back here, Mac. Go curl up on the front seat and keep the headlights on. But we're stalled here for the night, so let's make the best of it. Not on your life, Mac. The romance genre would run its course in the mid-50s. Superheroes did make a comeback for a while. Guys like Superman and Batman were the Walking Dead in the 50s, joining stupid clubs like the Legion of Superheroes or meeting bizarre twins from alternate universes. Dell Publishing had a field day with Donald Duck and Walt Disney Comics and Stories. comics written and drawn by another Oregonian, Carl Barks, from Merrill down south. But other publishers were convinced that the tried and true formula in comics featured women in peril. And they framed that peril in ever more sadistic terms. Yes, he is pushing her head down onto a burner. By the way, it's hard. You can't find this comic book because anyone who owns one is never going to sell it. I mean, these things are so popular. And if you think it doesn't get worse, now you desperately want to believe we're dealing with parody here, right? We're not really contemplating this. A paper cutter, a giant paper cutter. Parody, I hope, but I doubt it. This is not to say that geniuses were not in play or at play in the field in the 1940s, the late 40s. Bill Gaines assembled a sterling group of writers and artists, including Harvey Kurtzman, Al Feldstein, Jack Davis, Graham Ingalls, Gene Evans, and Johnny Craig, and launched EC Comics. The comics EC published over the next several years, Tales from the Crypt, Weird Science, Shock Suspense Stories, and Mad, which debuted not as a magazine, but as a comic book, are still considered genius for their ability with issues of social justice, racism, xenophobia, and sexual abuse. While the companies that published Superman and Captain America were saddled with characters who'd lost most of their energy, EC was staffed with a bunch of creative guys who were prepared to respond to the cultural idiocy of the medium and inspired once again to reflect on the angst and aspirations of the era. The Russians had launched a satellite. The Korean War had begun. There were communist conspiracies in Hollywood and the opening chords of the civil rights movement. The advent of television, a competitive medium that would transform image and culture. And there were the first complaints that comic books might be corrupting the fragile youth of America, creating a fresh generation of juvenile delinquents. How did the usual gang of idiots, as Gaines called the EC staff, respond? Merry Christmas. They turned the volume up, one of the things they did on their horror comics. And for a better use of that axe, one of the most famous covers in comic history, Exhibit A at the Senate subcommittee hearings into comics and juvenile delinquency, largely inspired by the publication of a book by Dr. Frederick Wortham, Seduction of the Innocent. When Bill Gaines testified before the subcommittee, he was shown this Jack Davis illustration and asked if he thought it obscene. No, Gaines said, he didn't. Perhaps if the woman's head had been raised a little bit to show blood dripping on the floor. Comics, it seemed, had finally gone too far. Image would indeed lead to epitaph. Censors rallied. Old comic books disappeared in bonfires. One of the reasons the books that dodge the flames are so valuable today. As the industry moved to censor itself with its own comics code, words like horror and terror were prohibited from the covers, and EC, save for Mad, which evolved from a comic to a magazine to dodge the censors, EC eventually went out of business. And save for several new introductions, it's a girl flying. It must be an illusion. Comics underperformed for the next 10 years, waiting for Stan Lee, Jack Kirby, and Steve Ditko to usher in the Marvel Universe. In the summer of 1968, on the onset of a horrific family odyssey from the Chesapeake Bay to sub-Saharan Minnesota, I stumbled upon a spinner rack at Dawson's Pharmacy in Severna Park, Maryland. Waiting for me there was this comic. Spidey had been hanging around for 5 years, but we'd never been introduced. Until then, comics were, for this 14-year-old, idiotic juvenilia, literary cow pies from an industry that never stopped chewing its cud. Spidey 68 didn't have an Alex Schomburg cover. What it had instead was a sweetheart of a storyline, and the greatest comeback in comics history, led by a chronic underachiever named Stan Lee. Lee had been in business forever, thanks largely to the benevolence of his uncle, Martin Goodman, who owned one of the companies. He was a hack, a relentless recycler of ideas, old ideas, and an odd duck. But in 1961, he finally had an original thought. Insecure, self-absorbed, utterly flawed comic characters. Gee, whatever gave him that idea? Could it have been the 60s, my generation, the age of Aquarius, the Woodstock Nation, the psychedelic drugs? Or another chance for comic books to reflect the angst and aspirations of the age? All right, because we've finally reached the chapters of comic book history that are all too familiar to most of us, thanks to Hollywood, I'm going to close with a few thoughts and images. The city of Portland is not far from the center of the comics universe, as it's home to Image, Dark Horse, Oni Press, and Periscope Studio. And if you're in pursuit of extraordinary work, you hardly know where to begin, which is, of course, is why I'm here. No, I haven't read them all, and I don't know if there's reason to once again review Mouse, which won the Pulitzer Prize, or Persepolis, or the delightful Raina Telgemeier. But I would certainly recommend the following if you're ever in the mood for a graphic novel. And I'll begin with Alison Bechdel's Fun Home, the rare graphic novel that trumps every bias about comics you have. There are other books I know that deal with the deeply flawed fathers and the clumsy emergence of a teenage girl's sexuality. They may be others that employ the likes of Marcel Proust, Oscar Wilde, and F. Scott Fitzgerald in the attempt to separate fact and fiction, and others that maintain a tender comic distance while exploring the tragic unraveling of an American family. But Fun Home is, like its author, the complete package. Bruce Allen Bechtel was a funeral home director, a smorgasbord of quirks, an occasional bully, an obsessive gardener, and because he was endlessly grappling with his homosexuality, his daughter believed he stepped purposely in front of the Wonder Bread truck that killed him. As she wrestles with that, Bechtel uses journal entries with an increasingly unreliable narrator, her father's letters, Charles Addams cartoons, and the books her father loved to come to terms with the man. Absolutely extraordinary book. When the Oregon Historical Society showcased 15 of the state's most influential artists, creators, and political cartoonists several years ago, Joe Sacco was at the top of the pile. He was the state's most tireless and fearless journalist, a war correspondent who had illuminated Palestine, Bosnia, and the Gaza Strip. And in the aftermath of October 7th, it may be more essential than ever to read Footnotes in Gaza and the rest of Sacco's work for a better understanding of the murderous enmity in the Middle East. This is Jeff Lemire back in the beginning, back before he took his storytelling skills to mainstream comics. In Ghost Stories, a large farmhouse in Essex County, Ontario. Let me begin that sentence again. In Ghost Stories, a lonely farmhouse in Essex County, Ontario, and a 1951 minor league hockey team frame this deeply moving story of two brothers and the woman who came between them. When Lou LaBeouf takes his younger brother's fiancée to a Toronto rooftop one night to share the snow and the moonlight, the cold and the dark stays with them for the rest of their lives. For understandable reason, I'm fully on board when graphic novelists turn to journalism rather than memoir. The Photographer is a collaboration between three guys whose names I'm hard-pressed to pronounce well, not being French. Didier Lefavre, Emmanuel Guibert, and Frédéric Lemercier. In 1986, Lefebvre trekked into Afghanistan with Doctors Without Borders, Nikon F2 in hand. 13 years later, Guibert came to his friend's house and after dinner said, "Be kind enough to choose one mission you've made over the last 20 years and tell it to me." Lefebvre just vanished into his workroom for 5 minutes. He returned with his contact sheets from his initial journey down the Silk Road, the first of his 8 missions into Afghanistan. He'd taken 4,000 photographs. Only 6 had ever been published. The photographer changed all that. It changes the dimensions of the graphic arts. It also forces you to consider where you should take your camera when you're running out of time. This one summer, a collaboration between Canadian cousins Mariko and Jillian Tamaki is the first graphic novel to receive a Calicut honor. It was also pulled from several school libraries after one superintendent declared it pervasively vulgar. There is profanity quite common to teenagers whose stories the Tamakis tell. And that's a story of 2 teens separated by 18 uncomfortable months, coming to terms with troubled parents, pregnancy, miscarriage, and a few other things deserving the occasional curse. But if I had to name my favorite graphic novel in recent years, it would be Royden Lepp's Rust. Masquerading as another dystopian tale of robots gone mad, Lepp, who lives in Seattle, delivers a meditation on fathers and sons, a story of war and remembrance, and an absolute thrill ride where a boy with a jetpack squares off against machines that would give Arnold Schwarzenegger pause. We are, as you can see, a long way and 85 years from Action 1. I rarely read newsstand comics these days, but I'm still drawn to the images on a comic and how they work. The work of the late Dave Stevens, who grew up in Portland. This is a Johnny Quest comic, by the way. Probably not like the Johnny Quest you remember. Josh Middleton, illuminating Wonder Woman in glorious light. Tula Late, an extraordinary artist from Northern England. Compare this cover to the cover of Archie 3 that I showed you a little while ago. Stanley Art Germ Lau, who was born and raised in Hong Kong. Again, the idea here and how he pulls this off. She's looking out the window, the reflection of Supergirl in the pain. It is just so, so cool. And we heard about, I think we opened at the beginning of this with thoughts from Storm. Here's Storm from Stephanie Hans of France. All in color for a dime. Not any longer. Usually $4, sometimes $5. Money well spent. Thanks, guys. That's it. I'll be happy to take any questions you have about any of this.
Steve, that was just wonderful. Thank you. I loved every minute of it. It was fascinating, and I had spent so many summers as a child, just sharing comic books among my friends and passing them around, and it just was so interesting, the history. Now, a question from Friendly House. Go ahead, please.
Well, I've always felt guilty about thumbing through all the comics when there used to be newsstands. But the question is, how long do you think on the average does it take them to draw one of those covers?
A great question that I don't have an immediate answer to. They weren't paid much for them. I mean, you got $50 generally for those comic book covers. So I don't think, if it took them a week, I don't know if they ate much. You know, I suppose when they were at their best, that might be 8 hours of work to put that together. And of course, now the way they're drawn is generally with a computer. There's much more happening on the computer in terms of coloring and shadow and stuff like that. But back in the beginning, yeah, you got to believe they could do a page of art or a cover like that in a day's work, because there was so much demand for them to do more.
Amazing.
Yeah.
We have a question from the Zoom audience. Al, can you come in, please?
Oh, yes, I've got a question. As you were talking about the comics, it reminded me of sheet music. And I pulled these two out of the drawer here. One is the All-American Girl, and the other is from World War I. You had a bunch of World War I's, I think, earlier. What kind of American are you? And these have a lot in common with what you're saying the comic books do. A lot of them have a pretty girl on the cover, like this one. She's not real prominent. And a lot of the songs had kind of humorous content, and a lot of people bought them who couldn't read music, but they'd buy them. Was this kind of is this like a forerunner to all the comics you got into in the 20s and the 30s? These 19 teens and 1910s, is there a link there between having the same artists do both, or that kind of stuff?
I'm not sure how direct it is. Are those covers that you just showed us signed? Or no?
Signed.
Yeah, or are they credited with, did the artist sign them? Or do you see if you open them up that the name of the artist is given credit? While he looks, I mean, I do know that, look, if you got it.
No, I don't. I don't see any signature on this one from the 1920s.
Mm-hmm.
And
okay. Yeah, Steve will answer at this point.
Yeah, I mean, if Norman Rockwell got paid incredible amounts of money to do the cover of Saturday Evening Post, but if you didn't have one of those jobs and you were working in comics, you were doing a lot of other stuff too. You were to get by. You needed more money, and comics didn't necessarily supply it. So, I mean, Schomburg was doing book covers. Schomburg was probably doing, print music covers. Schomburg was doing paint by number drawings, for God's sakes. So I'm sure if you were a good artist, there were incredible demands and incredible opportunities on which you could make money, including some of those things you showed us.
Okay. We have another question from Friendly House. Come on in. Speaker, that'd be number 2.
Matt Baker, the Black artist, and so you showed us maybe 2 or 3 of his covers, and they were all white women getting raped or whatever. Did he ever show any Black?
Well, and actually,
victims?
He was showing women, none of them, violence was not happening to the women, his covers. But no, not that I know of, that there was room for, in the late 1950s, there was room for Black artists in the business, but I'm not sure there was room for images of Black women. Yeah. Which of course is why the cover of Storm is so cool. That's in the world in which we live now. There's plenty of, not only are there room for those images, but half the characters in comicdom are changing genders or sexual orientations or whatever, because they're looking for a different audience. But Baker died far too early of a heart attack. He couldn't have been more than 40. Drew beautiful women, but for whatever reason, I don't know if there's too many illustrations where he drew beautiful Black women.
Yeah. Okay.
You know, Steve, as you're showing these images, it reminded me, of McMiniman artists that are here in Portland, where they've become. I'm trying to get this right. It's a common theme. It's beautiful art, but it's kind of, I'll think maybe I've got my question wrong. Let me go to Johnny here. He'll get one for us. Go ahead, John.
My turn?
Yes,
Okay.
it is.
At the Norman Rockwell Museum in New York, they claim they have all of the Saturday Evening Post covers. And you mentioned that some of them are owned by collectors. Rich?
No, I didn't. I said some of his paintings are owned by collectors.
Paintings.
I mean, Lucas and Spielberg have incredible Rockwell collections, but I don't know if they include Saturday Evening Post covers. I would guess they do, because I would be stunned if Rockwell didn't sell some of those, especially later in his career, when more than you need to know, but there's this very famous Rockwell painting of a woman and her son sort of praying over their breakfast in a cafe, and a sort of a guy looking at him like, what in the world are you doing?
I remember that one.
Over in the course of 5 years, that sold for $2 million,
wow.
Then $46 million. Because people were beginning to discover how great some of it and how iconic some of his art was. And given that, I'd be stunned if the Norman Rockwell Museum, which I thought was it's in New York, or is it in Massachusetts?
Western New York.
I would be.
No, I'm sorry. Massachusetts.
Yeah.
Western Mass. Okay.
Yeah, and I just would be stunned if they had all those covers, because there's such an appetite, hunger for them and for his art that
there was one I was really looking for when I was there, and they couldn't find it. And it was a little girl carrying a football, and all these little boys are bouncing off of her. And it's just my favorite cover. And they suggested it was probably on Boy's Life,
Yeah.
That the Boy Scout magazine. Remember?
Yeah.
So, thank you.
Great stuff.
I've got my question organized now. When the comics were published, they weren't considered art. They were just, like you said, pulp. They were just throwaway things. They're not considered art. And the McMiniman artists, of course, they're considered art, but it's on restaurant walls. It's on banquet halls. It's not considered. It's considered art, but it's McMiniman's art. It's connected to a restaurant. Do you think that the art when did the recognize that these were art? When the comic books were really art rather than just pulp pictures?
Well, again, the artists themselves didn't recognize a lot of that. It was the rare artists. George Petty is an example. He's pre-comics. George Petty was smart enough to require, when he did the Petty Girls for Esquire, that they return the original art to him. And there was Frank Frazetta never let go of a single piece of original art. And so now when one of his paintings sells for $6 million, it's the family that's getting the money for that. But for the longest time, original comic book art was basically thrown on the floor of the printing shop and to sop up, excess ink. There was no sense whatsoever that it could be valuable, which again is all the more reason why the stuff that did survive is worth silly amounts of money. And what's also happened with comics, and I think I put up one cover that was slabbed and had a grade on it. I forget, that would have been, the True Love Pictorial 11, where she's looking at the cold professional attitude of the artist who won't pay attention to her. So that comic has been sent away to CGC, which is this person grading company. And in collectibles now, comics, baseball cards, if you want to sell something, you basically need it graded and encapsulized in plastic, so that a third party, someone has come along and told you what the grade and value and condition of the book is, and B, it's encased in plastic and you can't do harm to it anymore. All these amazing comic book sales now at heritage auctions, almost everything that sells is encased in plastic and graded. no one back in when I was starting collecting comics, I just wanted a copy. I could have cared less what condition it was in. They were well read. They were folded in half. They had subscription creases. But the ones that somehow people almost didn't read but just slipped away, stored away, and are in superb condition as a result, those are the things that get, again, stupid amounts of money.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you. Joyce, go ahead. You have a question.
I too have been struggling with how I want to form my question, but I couldn't help but be struck by the shape of the women on the pulp magazines. And that shape to me is pornographic. It's titillating. And I'm wondering if there was a similarity between that and the Barbie doll. I kept seeing the Barbie doll. And is that, of course the movie doesn't do that, but are we looking at all, in a way, another form of pornography, wondering what little girls are how they're gonna react to that? And is your goal to be titillating?
Oh, God, yes. I mean, even now, that's probably the goal. But what is kind of cool about what's going on now is that, I mean, just those images I showed at the end, some of the greatest, I mean, you could see the difference in the quality of the art at hand from the way things have changed dramatically over the years. Those early comic covers, no one would confuse them with great art. The last 5 or 6 that I showed you, there's some really cool things going on. And some of the artists doing the best work that I enjoy the most are women. Tula Lette, Jen Bartel, Stephanie Hans, Jenny Friesen. So they're also drawing women, I suppose, to be occasionally titillating, but these are women who kind of know what a woman's body looks like, as opposed to the guy who thinks every woman has. Actually, I really can't finish that sentence. So at least I feel much better that women had a ugly place in comics for many years. There were occasional women artists, there were occasional women characters, but in the world in which we're now living, women have much more control over the medium and much more opportunities to tell their stories and draw their gender. So that's good news.
Hank, Rob, your hand is up. Can you come on in on Zoom, please?
Hi. I have sort of a double question. It's the relationship of terms, and that is, can you relate comic to graphic novel and illustrator to artist?
I think it was Will Eisner who created the Spirit back in the 40s, who came up with the whole idea and phraseology of the graphic novel. I think there was the term comics has so much baggage attached to it. It sounds, again, so juvenile that the artists and or illustrators who were, and we'll get to that in a sec, who were producing them and were sort of doing, I don't know if it was more serious, but it was more sustained, serious treatments of narrative. They wanted a sort of a better way to describe it, and graphic novel was sort of where they ended up. And again, my argument on that has long been that if the idea that words and pictures can't tell a better story than words alone seems ridiculous to me. I mean, if you have unbelievable words and they are aptly illustrated, all the better. Now, just in terms of artist and illustrator, I don't know if there's an important distinction. I mean, and again, so many of these folks now, the best in the business are both writing and drawing their work. But I don't even know, not being an artist myself, if being described as an illustrator connotes a little bit more majesty or whatever.
Well, if a picture's worth 1,000 words, graphic novels are very long.
Yeah, but that's not a bad thing. I don't know if you ever read one or no.
No, I just meant that that's the beauty of them, is that one page of illustration gets you 1,000 words.
It does, yeah.
Steve, you showed us some beautiful covers. Who did the actual comics? As the story goes on, would those have been those same men, or did they just hire that out to other people?
You know, I no longer, I don't know if I mentioned this, Dan, I still buy comics all the time. I never open them. Never read them. I mean, and it's not that there aren't really cool things going on, but after 55 years, I don't think I've read enough graphic novels, but I think I've probably read enough comics. What I'm drawn to is these cover images. And as over the history of the medium, you know, when I mentioned EC Comics, which was this glorious comic book company in the 50s, and Al Feldstein was an occasional artist, but he also wrote most of the stories. And the great thing about EC stories was they just had these, shocking's not quite the word, very unexpected endings. They were great with that little twisted hook at the end that you weren't expecting. Feldstein, again, wrote most of those stories. They would get together in story conferences. They would shoot around ideas, and Feldstein would have the story sort of sketched out and handed it off to the artist by the end of the day. But I don't know. I mean, I probably know the names of some of the people who were doing this, but I don't know if they would mean anything to any of us.
They weren't associated with the covers.
Well, look, I do want to be careful here, because there's been several seminal moments in comic history of late that had much more to do with the writers than the art. I mean, Frank Miller resurrected the Dark Knight, sort of Batman's true character. Batman was this sort of clownish figure through most of the 50s and 60s, and then Frank Miller comes along and not only draws incredible Batman comics, but again resurrects the Dark Knight, that sort of original incarnation of Batman. And if you have ever seen any of the Dark Knight movies on TV or at the movie theater, these are all inspired by Miller's work. There is a writer named Alan Moore from England who's unbelievable, who has changed the history of comics in any number of ways with Watchmen, V for Vendetta, a variety of storylines. So I don't mean to suggest that writers have not been, obviously they have done yeoman's work in the middle of all this in the evolution of the medium. I just don't necessarily go looking for great writers' work. I go looking for great art.
You're looking for art. Thank you.
In my collection.
Yes,
yeah.
In your collection.
The only other thing was those graphic novels I suggested to do at the end of the presentation, those are great narratives, and the writers are especially important in those in those comics.
It's not so much questions, some personal observations, because I'm a lifelong cartoonist myself. First of all, you mentioned about how it would take maybe 8 hours, or not eating much, to produce these great works of art. Well, one name that sprung to mind from an earlier era is Winsor McCay, who did The Little Nemo and Dream for the Rarebit Fiend. He was a lightning fast illustrator. He'd work, for newspapers, doing illustrations for them, and he knew anatomy and foreshortening and perspective well enough where, like a great jazz saxophonist, he can take all that technical knowledge that he has and just whip things out, original stuff on the spot. So I think that would be of help to some of these great artists you mentioned earlier. Second one, the difference between an illustrator and an artist. An illustrator has, mastered the technical side. And I cannot call myself an illustrator because I'm more of a storyteller who just happens to draw. So, but both sides could be potentially great artists in their own right.
That's right.
No, I appreciate that very much. When Shannon and I were working on our 2 graphic novels together, Oil and Water and the Mueller Report, it was funny because I was writing them and I would try to describe the way I wanted the story framed in several panels. And I'd hand it to him and he would look at me and just roll his eyes and tell me I was a total idiot. That what I was, because I don't understand art, what I was trying to get him to do, he said was just impossible. And so again, thank goodness there are artists who have a little bit better sense of that. Yeah.
I don't know if this is true, but to me, it was always obvious that art went straight to the emotions where, bypassed your cortex, where language and writing was just the opposite.
God, I hope not, given what I do. But someone once, there are things going on here. Someone once showed me a comic cover that I really reacted to, and he mentioned to me that one of the reasons I was reacting so significantly to it was the color red. The color red does something to us, does something to our heads that other colors don't. I do not understand that, but it was so, like, sometimes the use of the color red on a comic book cover will draw a much different reaction than one that's tinted in blue or green. I have no idea why that's true.
Yeah, hi. You had kind of facetiously mentioned the Mueller Report comic kind of being directed at kind of high school students or something like that. And I was just curious on your thoughts in terms of comics in like an education space, because like I've seen a lot of graphic novels kind of cropping up in like telling stories of like literature classics, things like a graphic novel of a Shakespeare story or something to that effect. I did have one class in college where one of the readings was a graphic novel about kind of like the life of some very famous logicians. And so I was curious about, like, do you think that comics are going to be playing a bigger and bigger role in education for covering really dry topics for youth? Or do you see like that kind of a pivot in that space as a potential?
Okay, so several quick thoughts on that. One of the reasons the Mueller Report is not in many high schools is because when you go to a high school and tell them, ask them if they would like this book, that whole process in schools is a 5-year, changing curriculum, changing. My wife used to work with the Lake Oswego School District as its communications director, and so I knew most of the teachers up there pretty well, and I would argue forever with the head of the English department that if you want to inspire kids and get them to want to read and write, put down Nathaniel Hawthorne and pick up Larry McMurtry. I mean, Lonesome Dove is the great novel in my head for the 20th century, and that's what you should be getting them to read. And if they read it, they're going to walk away from that book much more feeling moved and feeling like this book, as opposed, there's nothing wrong with the Scarlet Letter, a lot going on there, but there's nothing, there's much more happening that you can relate to, and the writing is equally as good in Lonesome Dove. So of course I would think comics, graphic novels need to get into the schools, because if kids don't respond to the narrative, they might respond to the storytelling in the art. And I don't know how many teachers yet. Look, I'm 69. I have grandkids. I'm well removed even from my kids being in high school or back then. So I don't know how much progress there's been in the faculty understanding what is going on, how many great things are going on with graphic novels. And of course, the other issue at hand here is the backlash against matters of gender and sexual orientation. You know, comics are on the cutting edge of a lot of those things. Fun Home, I mean, Alison Bechdel is a lesbian, and she's talking about her homosexual father, and it was New York Times or somebody called it Book of the Year anyway, not graphic novel of the year, Book of the Year. But I can imagine that if you went into, if you put Fun Home into a classroom, maybe not in Lake Oswego, but in a lot of communities, you would have a backlash. I had a 6-year-old daughter who had to be there on day one when the next Harry Potter came out. That happened twice, by the way, in O'Hare. We're flying cross country. It's 6 a.m. The bookstore has not opened yet. And there in the window, there are Harry Potter books. And my 6-year-old is beating me over the head with a backpack. Because, yeah, I mean, you get those unbelievable.
Steve, I mean, if you want to answer this question, how can normal people kind of counter the, Moms for Liberty and this banning books, and it's just so troublesome to me?
Well, I would first encourage you to look at what's out there, to read some of these things. Like I said, there are awkward, clumsy attempts to tell some of these stories by people of every race, nationality, gender, sexual orientation, whatever. But some of this, if you read the best work that's out there, you will be, I think, as moved and transformed by it as I have been. And then you tell your friends and you pull these things into your book groups. And when there's the next, what word am I looking for? Frustrating controversy at the school district. And by the way, this is probably not going to happen in Portland the way it's happened in Virginia and a lot of other places. But when there is that next controversy or question about what our kids should be reading and what books should be banned or pulled from the classroom, show up and talk about the way these stories moved you and the way you hope they will move your children and grandchildren. Anyway, thank you again, you all, for everything today. It's great to see you.
Mr. Dean, thank you so much for a wonderful presentation. It was fascinating and very moving, very moving. Thank you. I have one very sad announcement that I want to let you know. Arnie Panich passed away on Monday, and his wife Barbara, recognized that he had been a long member of HGP and for many years an MC. So in Arnie's honor, I am going to make and he was a jokester. He was the best bad joke guy that I've ever known, and so I'm in his honor. At Mount Rushmore in South Dakota, there are 4 American presidents, and they are George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Abraham Lincoln, and Teddy Roosevelt. A few years ago, a young guy climbed up there and put cocaine in one of the president's noses. To this day, we do not know which one is stoned.